3 Roman legions are dying in this forest, and the forest has not been on a map for 1,000 years. September of the year 9. The Saltus Teutoburgiensis. A column 4 kilometres long is sunk to its axles in black mud, shields swollen with water, pack animals on their sides with legs broken by the slick log corduroy underneath. From the slope above, javelins come down in short, irregular flights, the way hail comes down out of a low sky. The Romans cannot form a line. There is no line. At the head of the trap, by every chronicler who covers the day, sits a young Cheruscan prince who has spent the summer eating at the Roman governor's table and speaking Latin to him across the silver. 3 legions, 3 alae of cavalry, 6 cohorts of auxiliaries. 20,000 men, give or take. The army that had policed the Rhine and held the eastern bank from the Lippe to the Weser. The army that 2 summers earlier had wintered in tribal villages and collected taxes from chieftains who paid them in silver. That army is being destroyed almost to a man by the very enemy it had been slaughtering like cattle. That is not my line. That is Velius Paterculus, who served on the Rhine under Tiberius and who wrote his short history about 20 years later for a Roman audience that already knew exactly which legions he meant. 17, 18, 19. 3 numbers Rome never used again. This is the story of how an empire that had conquered Gaul in 8 years, that had crossed into Britain twice, that had pushed its eagles to the Elbe, lost 3 legions in 3 days inside a single forest. It is the story of how a Roman governor who had crucified 2,000 men in Syria on the eve of Pentecost was outthought by a German prince who had eaten at his table and called him father. It is the story of a frontier that froze where the bog began and never moved again for 400 years. Tacitus, writing about a century later, calls it the Clades Variana, the Varian disaster, the way a Roman house called the Year of the Fire by the name of the man who lit it. He does not really describe the battle. He describes what Germanicus's men found 6 years later, bones of an entire army still lying where they fell, skulls nailed to oak trunks, altars in the clearings where tribunes had been opened up like sacrificial bulls. Tacitus uses the verb to recognize, recognized by a shred of toga, recognized by a centurion's vine staff. The army went into the forest as a Roman army and came out as a list of objects. Velleius gives the number in 1 short clause. Modern scholars argue the total dead, with cavalry and auxiliaries and camp followers, sits at 20,000. The lower estimate is 15. There is no manuscript that fixes it. I'll keep saying 20,000 because Velleius is the closest source we have, and Velleius rounds down rather than up. The forest has a name. Tacitus calls it the Saltus Teutoburgiensis. For 1,000 years, that name pointed at nothing on a map. 18th century antiquarians decided it must mean the wooded ridge near Detmold and built a copper statue there in 1875. Hermann the Cheruscan with a lifted sword. Modern excavation says he is standing in the wrong forest. We'll come back to that. What matters is the ground. The Saltus is a wedge of high beechwood pressed between a ridge called the Vihengeberger and a bog the locals still call the Great Moor. Where the ridge and the bog come closest, there is a sand corridor barely wider than a Roman road, in places narrower than a wagon, plus a man on foot. An army of 25,000 cannot pass through that corridor as an army. It passes through as a thread, with the head 3 Roman miles ahead of the tail. The terrain decided this battle. The Romans walked into a tube. Somewhere near the head of the column rides a man who does not yet know he is dying. He is in his 53rd year, proconsul of Africa, governor of Syria, married into the Julio-Claudian house. His name was Publius Quinctilius Varus. He had been sent into Germania 3 summers earlier with one task: to convert a half-conquered land into a Roman province, to set up a justice system, to stitch the Rhine and the Elbe together with Latin paperwork. He had spent the summer doing exactly what his emperor had told him to do. In a clearing on the Weser plain, he had held a Roman magistrate's court. Lictors, fasces, the curule chair carried out into the long grass, and judged the disputes of Cheruscans and Bructeri by the law of the city of Rome. He kept several Cheruscan princes close to his table. One of them, the eldest son of the chief Segimirus, had been raised in the city as a hostage, had served as an auxiliary commander under Tiberius, had been granted Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. The chronicles call him Arminius. His own people, in their language, must have called him Erminas. He was about 27. He had eaten at Varus's table all summer. He had spoken to Varus in Latin. Hold that table in your head, because the table is what gets eaten in this story. The trap that closed in the Saltus did not start in the Saltus. It started in a triclinium under a Roman tent on the Weser plain, with Latin in the air and a man on the wrong couch. One more figure: Lucius Aegius, camp prefect, praefectus castrorum, the senior centurion of the army group. He is the man who is supposed to know where the aquilae are at every moment of the march. The aquila is the silver eagle of a legion, mounted on a long shaft, with a bronze fulmen clutched in its claws. The legion's identity lives in the bird. By the time this story ends, Aegius is dead, and 3 of his birds are gone. One into a bog so deep no Roman ever recovers it. One into a Cheruscan's sacred grove. One carried east into the lands of the Bructeri. The recovery of one of them will take more than 30 years. The legions to which they belonged, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, are never reconstituted. Rome buries the numbers with the men. To understand how 3 of Rome's legions ended up at the bottom of a German bog, you have to understand the empire that put them there. You have to understand the slow 20-year conquest of the country between the Rhine and the Elbe. The emperor who was running out of patience with it. The lawyer governor he sent in to finish the job. And the young Cheruscan auxiliary commander who had been planning, quietly, in 2 languages for a very long time. By the year 9, Augustus had been first citizen of Rome for 38 years. He was 71 years old. He had outlived 2 designated heirs, his nephew Marcellus, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, and he had been forced, against every preference of his blood, to pull Tiberius back into the line of succession. He was a tired man. He wanted Germania finished before he died. The conquest of the country between the Rhine and the Elbe had begun a generation earlier. His stepson Drusus crossed the Rhine in 15 BC and spent the next 7 summers pushing eastward, building roads where there had been bog tracks, fleets of platform barges to move legions up the Lippe and the Ems, fortresses every 20 Roman miles. Drusus got as far as the Elbe by 9 BC. By Dio's account, a German woman of more than human size stepped out of the trees there and warned him to turn back. Dio is fond of supernatural omens for any disaster that needs a frame, so take that story with care. But Drusus did turn back, and on the way home, his horse fell on him, and he died of his injuries 30 days later. Tiberius took over the work. By the year 4, the Rhine to Elbe land was being treated in Roman dispatches as a province. Not a fully digested one, the way Hispania Tarraconensis was a province, but a coming province. That is the country Varus walked into in the year 7, half converted, half armed, half watched. The Lower Rhine garrison ran to 5 legions, 4 of them west of the river. A second army group of 3 legions sat north of the Lippe under Varus's direct command, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th. They had been on the Rhine front for nearly 2 decades. They had been used to walking from one tribal village to the next, collecting tribute. They had no reason, in the spring of 9, to imagine they were about to vanish. Varus had come to them out of Syria. He had married into the family of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, the man who had won Actium for Augustus, which kept him inside the imperial circle. He had governed Syria for 2 or 3 years, and his name had survived there, in Josephus, as the man who had put down the rising after the death of Herod the Great. Josephus tells us he had 2,000 of the leading rebels crucified in a single day on the road outside Jerusalem. 2,000. That is the figure Josephus gives, and Josephus is not generally a flatterer of Roman governors. 2,000 crosses set up on a Judean road on the eve of Pentecost is a man telling a country what he is. Varus came to Germany believing he had already pacified one province by crucifixion and that he could pacify another by tribunal. That is the part of the story modern historians keep getting wrong. They write Varus as a fool, a soft administrator out of his depth in a forest. The Laius, who had served on the Rhine and disliked him, writes a more useful sentence. He says, Varus thought the Germans were nothing but men whose voices and limbs were human, but who were already tamed by the laws of Rome. He thought the work of conquest was complete, and that what remained was the work of governance. So he governed. He sat in his curule chair in clearings along the Weser. He levied taxes. He demanded the obligations of subjects, labor, supplies, the housing of Roman troops in winter quarters in tribal villages. None of this had been done in Germania the way it was now being done. Drusus had taken hostages. Tiberius had taken oaths. Varus took fines. The Cheruscan prince closest to him through that summer was Arminius. He was the elder son of Segamerus, chief of one of the dominant clans, and he had been sent to Rome as a hostage in childhood. He had grown up in Rome. He had received the toga virilis there. He had been enrolled in the equestrian order. He had served as commander of a Cheruscan auxiliary unit on the Pannonian front under Tiberius. He had returned to his father's people no more than 2 or 3 years before Varus arrived. He spoke Latin and Cheruscan with equal fluency. He understood the Roman order of march in operational detail. He understood also that every other young Cheruscan noble had grown up in a country being slowly absorbed into Rome, and that the absorption was about to become permanent. He was not the only Cheruscan at Varus's table. The other was his father-in-law, Segestes, head of a rival branch of the same elite, the father of the woman Thusnelda, whom Arminius had carried off in marriage against Segestes's will. Segestes had hated him ever since, and Segestes had been telling Varus all summer, in plain Latin, that Arminius was preparing a rising. He named names. He asked Varus to arrest Arminius, and himself too, if necessary, so the arrest would not look like a private grudge. Varus refused. The chronicles do not agree on the words he used. Florus has him laugh. Laius has him answer that he would not arrest a friend on the word of a personal enemy. The decision is the same. Varus heard the warning, weighed the source against the friend, and chose the friend. I cannot decide whether Varus's mistake was vanity or law. He may have refused to arrest Arminius because he liked him. He may have refused because arresting one Cheruscan prince on the word of another would unmake the whole apparatus of jurisdiction he was building. Either way, the warning was dismissed. By late August, the summer camp on the upper Weser was beginning to break up for the march back to winter quarters at Vatera, modern Xanten on the Rhine. The standard route ran southwest, along the Lippe corridor, through fortresses Drusus had built. It was the kind of march on which a Roman legion is least vulnerable. Varus's army formed up to take it, and then, at the table, Arminius brought a piece of news. A small tribe on the northeastern edge of the province had risen in revolt. Not a major uprising, the kind of thing a Roman governor handled on the way home. The rising would put a useful detour on the march, a swing through the country of the Cherusci, into terrain Varus had never crossed, but which Arminius knew intimately. Arminius offered to ride ahead with his Cheruscan cavalry and meet the column at the eastern edge of the trouble. Varus accepted. Segestes warned him again. Tacitus puts the scene at the farewell banquet, with Segestes naming Arminius and two other Cheruscan princes by name, asking Varus to put them in chains. Varus refused him a final time. He had decided to trust the man who had eaten at his table all summer over the man who had only warned him. The army marched east instead of southwest. The wagons turned away from the Lippe road. The column entered the country of the Cherusci, which is to say, the country Arminius had grown up in before Rome took him. 2 days into the march, the auxiliary cavalry under Arminius pulled out of the column on the agreed pretext of gathering reinforcements from friendly clans for the suppression of the revolt. They rode east and disappeared. The Roman column kept moving. Wagons, women, children of officers, baggage trains, a herd of cattle for the legion's rations. 20,000 fighting men strung out over 4 kilometres of forest track. Then the rain began. The German autumn of the year 9 came in early. Cassius Dio gives us the weather: wind, rain, a forest already half flooded under the wheels of the wagons. Dio is writing 2 centuries after the event, and he uses weather the way some historians use a sentence about fate, so I usually distrust him on it. But the Augustan coin finds at Kalkrisa cluster on the southern face of the Wiehengebirge slope and have been read by Wolfgang Schlüter's excavators after 1989 as the lost paymaster's chests of a column moving northeast in adverse weather, silver scattered along a slope where wagons went over. No coin in those caches was struck after the year 9. The weather was wet. The first day of the march into the Saltus, the column was still in formation. A vanguard, a baggage train, the 3 legionary blocks, each with its own aquila, the rear guard. The march pace dropped from the standard 24 Roman miles a day to something closer to 12, because the corduroy log road had rotted in many places and had to be repaired as they walked. Varus rode somewhere in the centre, with his legate Numonius Vala, with 2 of his sons, who had come out with him from Rome, and with the family of his eldest officers. There were women in this column. There were children. When the trouble started, it did not look like a battle. It looked like brigandage. Small groups of Germans came out of the trees on the slope and threw javelins into the column, killed a few men, vanished. The legions on the inside of the column, the unengaged side, did not understand what was happening on the slope side. The cavalry could not deploy on the flanks because there was no flank. The bog began 6 paces off the road. By Dio's count, there were several hundred dead before the column understood it was being attacked by an army. The attackers were Cheruscans, Bructeri, Marsi, Chatti, names I am putting down with caution because the source for the breakdown of the alliance is Dio writing 2 centuries on. What is certain is that the alliance was Arminius's. He had been building it for at least a year, quietly, in the way a young man fluent in 2 languages can build something quietly, by riding from one clan to another and saying the same sentence in the right dialect. The attackers knew the order of march. They knew where the legates rode. They knew where the baggage trains were heaviest. The Cheruscan cavalry that had peeled off 2 days earlier under Arminius were already on the slope. Arminius had taken the Roman drill, the Roman understanding of how cohorts cycle off a wall, and applied it in reverse against the men who had taught it to him. Varus did the one thing he could still do. He ordered camp. By the end of the first day, the column had pushed through to a piece of ground broad enough to fortify, somewhere on the eastern face of the Wiehengebirge, between modern Bramsche and Osterkappeln. The legions built a marching camp the way legions always built marching camps: ditch, rampart, palisade. By morning, the wagons had been triaged. Anything not absolutely necessary was burned. Civilians were ordered into the center. Varus, by Velleius's account, was already wounded. This is the moment in the chronicle where I find Varus most human. He understood, at the end of that first night, that he had walked into a war he had refused to see all summer. The curule chair, the lictors with the fasces, the Latin oaths, those props of his governance had been props for months. He had been governing a province that did not exist. The second day was the burning of the camp and the abandonment of the wagons. The column reformed and tried to march southwest, back toward the Lippe and Vetera. Arminius had foreseen the maneuver. The corridor between the Wiehengebirge Ridge and the Great Moor had been narrowed by felled timber across the track. The column, breaking out of the first day's killing ground, marched straight into the second day's. By late afternoon, a new camp was thrown up on slightly higher ground. Numonius Vala, the legate of cavalry, took what remained of his troopers, perhaps 1,000, and tried to break out southward to the Rhine to bring word. The cavalry was caught in the open before nightfall and cut down to the last man. If this kind of story is the kind of work you find yourself coming back to, chronicles, terrain, the small decisions inside a disaster that turn the disaster into history, this is the work the channel does. There is more of it, going back several centuries on either side of this one, back to the third day in the forest. The third day began before dawn. The Romans broke down what they had built, formed up inside the wreckage of their own wagons, and tried to march again, in worse order, with fewer officers, into ground that had been chosen for them. The Germans had spent the night doing the one thing left to do. They had built a turf wall. This is the detail the Calcreaser excavations gave us that no chronicler ever had. A sand and turf rampart, 18 Roman feet thick at the base, 6 Roman feet high, running for about 400 meters along the southern face of the Calcreaser Berg, parallel to the road on the high side. It is in the published archaeological record from 1989 onwards. Behind the wall, Arminius had infantry posted in close order. In front of the wall, the corridor narrowed to a place where a Roman maniple could not deploy. The third day is the day the Roman army stops being a column and becomes a series of small groups, each fighting its own battle without command. The legate of the 17th falls early. The aquilifer of the 18th tries to hold his position by a wagon and is killed across the wagon. The centurions try to enforce a square against the rampart. They cannot. The Germans are above them, behind them, and in front. The marshes are to the right of the column. The slope is to the left. The corduroy road has been broken up into a series of small fights between a Roman section of 80 men and a German group of half that, again and again, all down the corridor. Somewhere in this third day, Lucius Aegius, the camp prefect, is killed. The Aquila of the 19th, the silver eagle on its long pole, with the bronze fulmen in its claws, goes down with him into the bog on the right side of the road. Tacitus tells us where the second eagle was, and where the third eagle was. The first eagle, the one of the 19th, the chronicle does not tell us. The silence holds. By the late afternoon of the third day, Varus is on his sword. Velleius records the death plainly. He found the strength to die, in the manner of his father and his grandfather, by his own hand. Both ancestors had been suicides under earlier regimes. The family had a way of leaving. The legate Saonius surrendered, and Florus says of him what Roman chroniclers do not say lightly, that he was a coward, that he chose chains. The other senior officers chose the sword. The fighting carried on for some hours after Varus was dead. A young tribune named Caedicius, in command of one of the auxiliary cohorts, took what was left of his men into the woods and got them as far as a small fortress on the Lippe. He is the reason we have any direct testimony at all about what happened in the forest. He survived. He told it. By nightfall on the third day, the corridor at the foot of the Wiehengebirge was a long heap of dead Romans and dying horses, with German warriors moving along the line in small groups, taking armor, taking weapons, taking heads. 3 aquilae were lifted out of the wreckage and carried east into the forest, to the clearings the chroniclers called sacred groves. The Saltus had been sealed at both ends, and the army inside it had been killed. To understand what those 3 days made, and what they failed to make, you have to look at what the Germans did next, with the men they had captured, and with the bodies of the men they had not. What the Germans did next is the part of the story Tacitus could not write without flinching, and he writes about 100 years removed from the day. He describes Germanicus's expedition in the year 15, marching back into the Saltus 6 summers after the disaster. The bones were still where they had fallen. The bog had held them in place. Long bones of horses, the vertebrae of men, helmets without faces in them. And, here and there in the forest above the road, what Tacitus calls oak trees, pinned with the skulls of those who had survived to be captured. The captured did not survive long. Tacitus says the senior tribunes and the first-rank centurions were taken to clearings in the trees, the sacred groves the chroniclers call lucus, and were sacrificed there. Florus is more direct. He says they cut out the tongues of some of them and stitched the mouths shut and held up the tongues and said, Florus's Latin is uncomfortable here, "Viper, you have hissed at last." The detail may be Florus reaching for rhetorical effect, but the basic fact that the prisoners taken to the groves were killed in ritualized ways across several nights after the battle is in 3 independent chroniclers and in the archaeology. Bone pits at Calcresa contain skulls broken in patterns inconsistent with battlefield wounds. The men in those pits were killed at leisure. The body of Varus was found by the Cheruscans on the field. His attendants, before being killed themselves, had begun the rite of burning him. The Cheruscans pulled what remained out of the half-burnt pyre. The head was severed and sent east to Marabodus, king of the Marcomanni, as an invitation to join the rising. Marabodus refused and sent the head south to Augustus in Rome. This is the artifact the chronicle keeps turning back to in this story. Not the eagles, not the silver. The head of Varus, packed in salt, travelling along the imperial post road from the Upper Rhine to the city over the course of, by my reading of the distances and the speeds, about 3 weeks. Augustus received it in the early autumn. Suetonius, writing a century later, gives us what is almost certainly the only line in all of imperial Roman history that has survived as a private utterance. And it survives because Suetonius's grandfather may have heard it. The emperor, on hearing the news from the messenger before he saw the head, beat his head against the doorpost of his own palace and shouted 3 times. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore. 1, underscore, underscore. Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. He wore mourning for months. He did not shave. He did not cut his hair. The man was 71, and his head was bandaged from the wound of beating it against wood. And an empire that had not known a defeat of this scale in a generation watched him grieve like a soldier's mother. The wider damage was made of empty squares. 3 legionary numbers were withdrawn from the rolls. 17, 18, 19. Rome never used them again. The empire that had numbered legions up to the high 20s and would later number them past 30, never re-raised these 3. The numbers became something close to bad currency. Modern argument has not been about whether the disaster happened. It has been about where. For most of the 19th century, the German consensus placed the killing zone near Detmold, where Ernst von Bandel finished the Copper Hermann monument in 1875, with the sword pointing west. Generations of school groups visited that statue, believing they were looking at the place Varus died. They were not. In 1987, a retired British Army major named Tony Clun, posted to the British Army of the Rhine, began a metal detector survey on a wooded slope near the village of Calcresa, about 100 kilometres northeast of the Hermann monument. He found Augustan denarii, lead sling bullets, a bronze mask from a Roman cavalry parade helmet. Wolfgang Schluter at Osnabrück took over the dig in 1989. By the early 1990s, the team had uncovered the turf wall, the pits with the bones, the scattered weapons of 3 legions. The Detmold-Grotenberg school is not dead. Reinhard Wolters at Tübingen has argued the Calcresa site might represent one of Germanicus's later battles rather than the original disaster. I lean toward Calcresa as the killing zone, partly because of the coin dates and partly because the turf wall fits the German tactic more cleanly than any other site in the region. Lean. Not certain. The aquili came back one by one. The eagle of the 18th was recovered by Germanicus's officer Lucius Stertinius in the year 15, from the country of the Bructeri, where it had been mounted in a sacred grove. The eagle of the 17th was recovered by the general Gabinius Secundus in the year 41, under Claudius, from the country of the Chauci, more than 30 years after it had been lost. The aquila of the 19th was never recovered. By every responsible account, it is still somewhere in the bog or was melted down for silver before anyone could find it. Some objects do not come back. What the disaster made in the next 50 years was a different idea of the German frontier. Augustus, between the autumn of 9 and his death in the year 14, abandoned the project of provincial Germania between the Rhine and the Elbe. The legions that survived were drawn back to the Rhine bank. The fortresses at Vetera and Mogontiacum, modern Xanten and Mainz, became permanent. The eastern bank was given up across the years 9 to 16, in spite of Germanicus's 3 expensive summers of campaigning under Tiberius. Germanicus won battles. He buried the bones. He recovered 2 of the eagles. He did not get the province back. Tiberius recalled him to Rome and told him to write his memoir. The line of empire fell back to the river. It did not move again eastward for 4 centuries. What the disaster made in the next 200 years was the absence of an idea, the Roman idea that the Germani would, like the Gauls before them, eventually take a toga and a Latin name and a legal forum. After Varus, the rhetoric stops. Tacitus, writing in his Germania around the year 98, can describe the peoples east of the Rhine because there is no longer any imperial project of converting them. They are something else now. The frontier has hardened into a wall, first wooden, then earthen, then in places stone, running from the Rhine across the Taunus and the Upper Main and back down to the Danube. The Limes Germanicus, a line that says, "These are us, those are them," and the law of Rome does not cross. The disaster of the Saltus made that line possible, and then, 4 centuries later, when the line broke, the same peoples whose grandfathers Arminius had led poured west across it and ended the Western Empire. Arminius himself did not live to be old. By Tacitus's brief obituary in Annals 288, he was killed by a faction of his own kin around the year 21, 12 years after the Saltus, in an internal Cheruscan quarrel. He was 37. Tacitus, who never quite says what he admires, comes closest there. He calls Arminius the liberator of Germania, who fought the Roman people not in its infancy, but at the height of its power, who was sung about by the barbarians still in Tacitus's own day. That line is the closest a Roman senator could come to saluting the man who killed 3 Roman legions. The Hermann monument near Detmold still stands. It is in the wrong forest. The right forest, the long sand corridor under the Teutoburg, has a small museum with a turf wall reconstruction and a few denarii in a case. There are no markers there. Tacitus reports that Germanicus, in the year 15, had his men gather up the bones and bury them in a single great tumulus, and that Tiberius was angry that a serving general had taken on a priestly task. The location of the tumulus is unknown. Some of the bones in the bog were never gathered. They are still down there, under the peat, with the rivets of armor and the silver of one eagle nobody ever came back for. If the chronicle is to be trusted here, and the silence is to be read as evidence, then the lesson of the Saltus is the simplest one a frontier can teach. Empires do not lose provinces to men they have never met. They lose them to the man who has been eating at their general's table, who has been speaking their language at it, and who has decided, somewhere between the second course and the fourth, that he is going home in the autumn. The rest of the chronicle keeps. The next one is already on the channel. I'll meet you there.